Okay, so in this course, we're going to talk a bit about photosynthesis. Obviously, this is an important defining feature of plants. You might have covered photosynthesis in your other classes before. We're not going to cover it in a lot of biochemical detail. I have a few students every semester that are really interested in that, and most of the students every semester would probably rather not rehash something. So we'll kind of cover the details that are most important to us. For today, just a little introduction to photosynthesis, a refresher of the reaction, right? So photosynthesis, again, involves plants taking light energy and turning that into biochemical energy. This is something they can do that is basically unique to photosynthesis. So if you look at life on Earth, there are not a lot of ways that organisms can just turn the physical energy in the world into energy they can use biochemically. So plants are very important in that respect. And the basic reaction involves an endpoint of building a sugar molecule. We kind of use this as a stand-in. The important part of this sugar molecule is that it's got carbon molecules that are attached to each other. So we built an organic molecule. And organic molecules can be converted into other organic molecules. But other organisms besides plants can't easily, or can't, we certainly can't, do this process of taking atmospheric carbon dioxide and turning it in, slapping it onto an existing molecule. So this is the not balanced equation. So some CO2 molecules, some water molecules combine together to give us a sugar molecule, and then oxygen is this output, really even kind of a waste product from the perspective of the original photosynthetic organisms. Obviously very important to us, right? We also like having oxygen in the air to breathe, and plants can do that for us. So plants produce molecules that we can eat for food. So biochemically, they're taking sun energy and making chemical bonds, and then those chemical bonds can be broken by us during something like cellular respiration, where we break apart a carbon containing molecule like sugar and release carbon dioxide and gain some energy for us. So the energy we use comes from the food that we eat, and if we don't eat food, we don't have energy, right? So this is a gecko taking advantage of a plant that is secreting a nectar, trying to get this gecko to pollinate the flowers. This is actually a rare gecko-pollinated flower here. All right, so as we introduce the topic of plants, I wanted to give you another welcome here and introduce an interesting term. I think that's kind of a good one to know as a person who's studying plants, neophytes. Maybe you've heard this before. I don't think it gets thrown around a whole lot. A neophyte is somebody who's new, like a novice or getting started on something. And we use this term not always, typically not referring to plants, but it's based on words that refer to plants. So neo is new, phyte is a Greek word meaning plants. And so this is new plants. Welcome, new plants. Sort of like a sprout, right? So you can talk about people who are new to something as neophytes. And just keep in mind, if you learn that word and use it, it's based on plants. So the topic of the class, the name of the plant class is the plant kingdom. And we're going to we defined a little bit about what plants are. And I just want to kind of introduce you to the topic of the plant kingdom. It's a little bit of an old concept. I think it's a cute name to have for the course. It's what was named when I started the course, and I think I'll just keep that name. You know, we kind of talk about different divisions of life, and people generally know what plants are. The plant kingdom still, I think this concept still has some weight, but it's an old concept, and it traces way back to this document and even before. This is the Systema Naturae, the system of classifying nature. Regna Tria Naturae, the Three Kingdoms of Nature by Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. Carl Linnaeus, the person who came up with our classification system that we still use. And at this time, there were, you know, as he published his papers, basically giving names to a bunch of things in nature. So the three kingdoms, I like to ask my class, what are the three kingdoms? Well, it's a very old concept. This is basically three kingdoms of animals, vegetables, and minerals. So the vegetables would be the plants. And of course, from an early time, the plant kingdom contained also fungi, lichens, things like that. And microscopic organisms, so bacteria, were not really known to the people who were doing classification back in this day. So obviously we've come a long way in the way we classify organisms, and we still sort of refer to the plant kingdom. We don't think about fungi as belonging to the plant kingdom these days because technically fungi are more closely related to animals. But we are going to cover a little bit about fungi in this class, mostly because they're important and they don't get covered in any other classes that get taught sort of as a diversity class, right? So the animal classes aren't going to teach you about fungi. We don't have a specific fungus class, so we'll cover a little bit about it here. And they do have a lot in common with plants, even though they're not all that closely related. All right, so a few things. We showed images of organisms that can do photosynthesis, and not all of those that can do photosynthesis would be classified as plants. So plants, when we use this term plants today, not in the historical plant kingdom sense, but when we talk about plants, that's basically synonymous with land plants. Not to say all plants that grow on land, but plants whose ancestor grew on land. And so that excludes the sort of the closest relative of the land plants that's not a plant would be our green algae, which we have as single-celled green algae, and also some that are multicellular and visible to the naked eye. We call those macroalgae. Those are not plants. This one here, the cyanobacteria, not a plant, actually belongs in the group, the division of bacteria, but can do photosynthesis and is green. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and either green algae or cyanobacteria, so they don't meet the land plant criterion. Fungi, as I mentioned, actually more closely related to animals. They don't do photosynthesis. They share some features in common with plants of basically not moving, being fixed in place, and they reproduce by spores, which is something we'll see in the plants, but they are actually quite distant from plants in the tree of life. Now, a couple of these are, in fact, plants. We'll start with maybe the more familiar one. Over on the bottom right is a moss. So this moss plant is a land plant. It's kind of similar to the first land plants, as we'll see. We'll kind of take a little bit of an evolutionary approach to plant diversity in this class. And then just one more that I like to throw in here to throw people off. This is called the ghost pipe. This is a plant you can find around here. This is a flowering plant. These are its flowers hanging down. It is white because it has lost the ability to do photosynthesis. So its ancestor was a land plant, came onto land. Somewhere along the way, this plant figured out basically how to cheat or be lazy. It doesn't do photosynthesis, and it gets its nutrient molecules. It actually gets those from other organisms in the soil. So it kind of behaves a little bit more like a fungus, but it's technically a land plant. So looking at the whole tree of life, you can see where these shake out. This is a tree that it's kind of skewed with more representation of the organisms that get more study. So admittedly, the animals get a lot of study. Probably even if you weren't a plant person coming into this class, you probably thought the animals were a little more interesting to study. So they're represented on here, not photosynthetic in the animal part of the tree of life. Fungi over here, as I mentioned, this is their common ancestor, fungi with animals. And some of these have photosynthetic associations. So the host part of a lichen is a fungus, and then other fungi don't associate with algae or cyanobacteria. We'll talk about those. Over here in the bacteria, there are some bacteria that do photosynthesis. We call those cyanobacteria. Also a bunch of bacteria that don't do photosynthesis. Over here, the group called Archaeplastida includes the eukaryotic algae and then also the land plants. So this little slice here of land plants, those are the ones that we would technically consider plants in the plant kingdom course. Looking at how things changed over the span of time since the Earth came around. This is a timeline starting at the beginning of the Earth. So the origin of the Earth around 4.5 billion years ago. And as things went along, there was the first billion years or so when there was nothing alive on Earth, as far as we can tell. There's a little bit of evidence for the first organisms that were ever alive around here at 3.7 billion years ago. So first there were living cells, and not too long after that, photosynthesis came around. So somebody had to be getting energy from the environment, because prior to photosynthesis, there was no plants making food, nothing doing photosynthesis to make food. There were ways to make food, say, using thermal energy prior to that point. But really coming up with photosynthesis was a major step forward. A lot of the proliferation of organisms that could use light to make food, and they did very well for their thing for a very long time. With only prokaryotic cells, so cells without nuclei. And then around this time, a little before 1 billion years ago, the eukaryotic algae were able to do photosynthesis. And that was kind of starting onto the road for the land plants to come around. So eukaryotic green algae then gave rise to the land plants. And then this became, this little snapshot I'll show you blown up on the next slide, is the span of time when the larger, visible to the naked eye, land plants would have come around. So zooming in on that portion, this starts at 550 million years ago. And the land plants, along with going onto land, there were several changes that we'll talk about, basically adapting to be able to grow on land, right? And the first plants that could grow on land, their descendants are today what we have as the mosses and their relatives, otherwise known as the bryophytes. And then a few different changes came along, evolutionary changes that enabled plants to become more larger and more complex. So around 400 million years ago, vascular tissue, specialized cells that could conduct water to higher parts of the plant, allow plants to become bigger, right? So they can get water from the soil up to their leaves. That was due because they had the ability to use vascular tissue. That gave us the ferns and their relatives in this group. And then over here, not much later, I guess, seeds came around, and seeds gave us the conifers, which have seeds, and also the flowering plants, which have seeds and flowers. So the diversification of all these groups happened before the dinosaurs came around. This is the dinosaur period, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. And the origin of the flowering plants, we'll talk about in a later lecture. Roughly, let's say around here, Triassic, Jurassic period, first flowering plants. So just from this diagram, you can see that developing new strategies or evolving new abilities allow these groups to diversify and become different groups that we have over time. And then finally giving us the land plant, flowering plants that are the most diverse today.